Is that so? Okay. We are live. This is Senate Finance on January 31st. And today, I apologize in advance, reading the ones that some of us had joint fiscal committee until about quarter after. So I will be here. We got today, we get some initial concerns, impressions, and from groups that work regularly in the school. So we have the superintendents, the teachers, the principals, and the business managers. You probably know as much as we do about the governor's proposal. We got some numbers yesterday, but there's still a little unconfirmed. But this committee is in the process of listing things we need to know. What don't we know? What do we need to know? What do we need more clarity on before we can even start making decisions? And our fiscal office is in about the same position. They're still working to get enough information to do some runs and do some predicting. But we thought we'd give everybody a chance to tell us their initial impressions, concerns. And then as we go through this process and things start just get to be a little more settled in the concrete, we won't have anybody back. We'll have something a little more solid to work with. But I'm going to start with Chelsea Myers and Libby Bonesteel. I'm not having an individual when you
We're going to do it together.
Okay.
I'm Chelsea's arm.
So if you haven't been here, just introduce yourself and who you represent for the record. That the floor is yours. That clock is 10 minutes past. Oh, 2 minutes. Very far. We should be here 2 minutes early. Will do. Okay. There's Ray Nichols. Okay. Okay, George.
Yeah, Chelsea Myers, Executive Director of the Vermont Superintendents Association. I took over for Jeff Francis, who had a long tenure with the association in August after about 30 years of serving the Vermont Superintendents Association. Just very briefly, my background in education started in educational neuroscience research, primarily around early literacy. Did some classroom teaching as well, but have focused most of my career so far on education policy and what that entails. So that's a little bit about my background, and it's always important to hear from superintendents when giving this testimony. So I brought along Libby Bonesteel, who will introduce herself.
I'm Libby Bonesteel. I'm the superintendent for Montpelier. It's nice to see some of you all again.
Yeah.
How long have you been superintendent? Oh, this is my 7th year of superintendency in Montpelier.
So in full caveat, this testimony is what we knew up until yesterday before you got more information about like the numbers and the dollar amount. We will analyze that further, but just letting you know that we have not had time to like really look into and dive into this. So this will be a little bit higher level. We are closely examining how the governor's budget and education reform proposals align with the pillars of equity, quality, and efficiency, values essential to ensuring success for all students. While superintendents agree that changes are needed, and I want to emphasize that it's almost unanimous, or it is unanimous that change is needed and in a big way to strengthen our education system. It remains to be seen how the governor's plan will address the underlying cost drivers while maintaining educational quality. Superintendents appreciate the governor's effort to hold tax rates level as discussions about reform continue. This approach acknowledges that most FY26 school budgets are already set, with budget warnings finalized or in progress. Vermont school leaders are working diligently to craft thoughtful budgets that balance educational equity inequality with external cost pressures, including rising healthcare costs and infrastructure demands. We noted that healthcare is not one of the 4 bills described in Governor Scott's address, with over 70% of education spending allocated to salaries and benefits, and healthcare rates rising 11.9% this year after a 16.4% increase last year. It is impossible to discuss education costs without addressing this significant factor. Any meaningful effort to reform Vermont's education system must include a strategy to manage healthcare costs effectively. The governor has repeatedly referenced the need to right-size our school districts and our infrastructure. Vermont's immediate school facilities needs are estimated at $228.6 million, with total infrastructure costs exceeding $6.35 billion, figures that the Agency of Education acknowledges are likely an underestimate. Addressing these urgent needs is essential for any successful education reform effort. In regards to district scale in Vermont, it is clear that we have some work to do. While the governor's use of the superintendent's regional meeting structure for his proposal for 5 school districts is flattering, it raises important questions about why he chose it. The superintendents formed these regions for monthly meetings, not as a framework for an efficient, effective statewide education system. Research on district size generally paints a picture of benefits on a U-shaped curve. Studies indicate that smaller districts typically face higher per pupil costs due to inefficiencies, such as transportation and underutilized facilities and higher administrative costs. However, very large districts may encounter diseconomies of scale, where the benefit of increased size are outweighed by bureaucratic inefficiencies and challenges in maintaining educational quality. A research study found that consolidating small districts can reduce per pupil costs. Their research suggests that the cost savings are most significant when small districts, those with fewer than 300 to 500 students, consolidate. But these savings diminish for larger districts. Another research study reviewed the literature on economies of size in education and concluded that cost savings may be substantial when small districts may be substantial when small districts combined with there's little evidence of sizable cost savings in large district consolidations. They suggest that the optimal district size for minimizing costs per pupil while maintaining educational quality appears to be in the 2,000 to 4,000 student range. They also find that diseconomies of scale may begin for districts above 15,000 students. A study conducted in Kansas with a much more rural population stated that diseconomies of scale emerge at 10,000 students. While cost savings likely can be realized at the administrative level with greater economies of scale, that alone will not be sufficient. Superintendents remain open to the discussion of a foundation formula. Recognizing the current weighted per pupil spending range of 10,000 to 18,000 is inequitable and frankly unacceptable. While the Pikus and Auden report offers a framework for adequacy based on staffing rules, it does not account for Vermont's unique vision for education, as reflected in the revised education quality standards or existing laws such as the multi-tiered systems of support. Policymakers should be cautious about adopting a formula based solely on staffing models that do not align with Vermont's current educational landscape or future goals. Additionally, VSA remains concerned about ensuring adequate funding through economic and political fluctuations. Large-scale reform must be carefully sequenced and not change the funding system without simultaneously addressing the delivery system. Doing the same with less will only harm students. Finally, VSA appreciates the inclusion of PCV mitigation funding in the budget. However, the proposed $10 million is insufficient to meet statewide needs, potentially falling short of addressing North Country's needs alone. VSA strongly advocates for full remediation funding and a pause on further testing until a comprehensive facilities plan is developed and adequately funded. I'm going to pass it over to Libby, who has a lot more context around the kind of the framework around Pikus, the Pikus report and the staffing models. That you can provide some context to that.
Sure. Secretary Saunders came to our all member meeting last Thursday and provided the initial modeling. I would assume is a good way to put that from the Pikus report around staffing. And it seemed to superintendents pretty arbitrary. So the elementary schools were based on a population size of 450 kids, which is not what the majority of our elementary schools are, and the high school size was 600. Inside that, looking at the elementary schools alone, because I just have it seared in my memory at this point, is that in a 450 member school, student school, they had 2.2 instructional coaches versus one interventionist. So I point to Chelsea's testimony around multi-tiered system of support alone. So my school here at Union Elementary School has 400 kids. So you'd start, doing the ratios with those numbers. And I'd have 0.8 interventionists for a population of 400 students when it's a requirement for multi-tiered systems of support that simply doesn't match up for us. When asked, they said, oh, well, you can rely on federal dollars, which was scoffed at this point in time by many superintendents in the room. Federal dollars also assume levels of poverty, which makes the assumption that only kids who are qualified for free and reduced lunch may need extra supports in schools, and that's simply not an assumption that's accurate. So the PICUS and ODIN modeling doesn't match what's expected of us here in Vermont today with our schools, not with size, or which we could get to the size, but then that's talking about delivering governance in a different way of closing small schools. So all of these things are intertwined with one another, and you can't just do one. And when you're thinking about what we want and what we require of our schools in Vermont, you have to understand that that takes human resources in order to do.
If I can go back to your testimony, in your review of the literature about optimum school district size, did you see any place that stuck out to you where they actually found a difference between what I'm seeing as two categories and types of oversight, which is urban versus rural? Was there an optimum school size of a difference that was more economical when you had higher density populations versus communities?
Yeah, to be clear, the research is there, but not hugely expansive. So I want to caveat that. But when you look at, for example, the caveat or the diseconomies of scale found in a study that looked at broader populations, they put it at 15,000. But when looking at Kansas, for example, which has a more rural environment, they put it at 10,000. And so when talking about, and then additionally with the smaller school districts, the thought that the cost savings happen in from 300 to 500 consolidation. So putting like a 500 kid with another 500 kids district together, that is most efficient and effective in rural communities, those smaller district consolidations. Again, I want to be clear that there's more research that could be done for sure, but that's what the research is showing at this point.
Are you going to provide us with something in writing, or have you already
I did.
summarizing? All right, so it's been sent to the committee.
Yeah.
And does it footnote the sources?
Yes, so I'm going to point you to, I delivered testimony in House Ed this morning, and I put a policy brief in there that has very detailed information about everything that I've talked about
Okay, in terms
here.
of where the statistics came from.
Yep,
That'd be
there's
very
all
helpful.
the citations are in the paper. I was anticipating just doing kind of a broad overlook here, but that testimony has all of that information that I pulled from that. So, yeah.
Do we have that? Because it's not on our website.
I certainly can send it to you. Yes.
Yeah, we will get it because district size is more of a function of the education committees.
Right.
They took the superintendent association guidelines for lack of anything else. But I think the discussion in here is the governor proposes and we change it. Those lines are not written in stone. I think we've noticed that the wealth is on one side of the state and the lack of wealth is on another. But if it is all a shared tax base and we're looking at a statewide tax, that may not matter. It might matter. It will matter more when we're dealing with Brigham. And what we give Central another.
So just to follow on, I'm interested in your reactions, not just to what the governor's budget is and the plan that's discussed is, I think you, as everyone else in Vermont, know the fact that we have cost pressures that are concerning to many, many taxpayers. And so I ask a broad question, well, what would you do if you were us? What in terms of getting the costs down to a point that people can afford to pay it, what do you suggest that we do?
Yeah, so in that policy brief, I just want to state so that if I don't get all the details off the top of my head, in that is several policy recommendations. And what I will caveat that with, and that's based on instructional guides. We have not approached the funding model yet. We're kind of taking it in pieces as well. And there are 6 recommendations within that policy brief. And what I would say to that is also that it's not, those policy recommendations are not an end state. They are what we feel like is an intermediary step in which we can then get to whatever we decide as a Vermont community, what education should look like in the future. And so we understand that there are considerable tax pressures now. And so these recommendations are to try to help alleviate some of those while the long-term visioning can happen. So don't believe that we should not do anything now because we're waiting to do like larger visioning work. I think we absolutely should do things now, but it should be incremental and manageable so that we do not risk quality for our students.
Well, I guess there leads to 2 questions in my mind. One, what should we do right now?
Yep.
One, in your opinion, and the opinion of the superintendents, and then second, in terms of this long-term plan, we have, I think it's 34 or 35 long-term plans that have been done over the past 40 years. And I think that as far as many folks in the body here are concerned, we don't need another study. We need to act.
Yeah. So the first kind of steps that we recommend around instructional side is setting the minimum district size in the district quality standards. It is the existing framework in which we are holding school districts accountable for proper and efficient functioning. They will be rolled out in July. And so using that as a mechanism, if it is our chosen accountability structure, to set an actual minimum district size requirement and to have the AOE use their resources to help facilitate those mergers. So that's the first on district size. The second is because of the really cumbersome governance structure that we have a tremendous amount of school board members in this state. We recommend that all SUs transition to school districts and to account for the non-operating versus operating, that we move to the designation piece where that any schools that are merging or school districts that are merging with other school districts within different operating structures, that there would be a designation of 3 schools of choice to serve as the schools in that newly formed school district. So it would be going from an SU to an SD. And effectively, governance is not, school board members are volunteers, so they don't effectively have cost to them. But I would argue that when you have 9 school board meetings that your central office is running or supporting each month, that takes considerable resources away from the instructional leadership that they could be providing. And so the governance changes would, we believe, have an effect on efficiency and effectiveness. And that the change from districts to the 2,000 to 4,000 student minimum would also reduce the number of central offices and allow for there to be more specialization of positions in those central offices.
Would you reduce any staff?
Of central office?
Anywhere.
So it would be fewer central offices in our view.
So there would be fewer staff people that.
Yeah, so then getting to school size on the instructional level, our recommendation is again in the district quality standards to set minimums of the 300, which is based in research for elementary schools and 600 for secondary schools. We highly recommend that the movement towards the minimums is focused first on secondary schools. We're seeing huge disparate programs of study across different size high schools, and it's having a really big impact. And so efforts to work on scale in the high school grades, we think is the most essential at the school level. And then finally, at the class size, we recommend that class size minimums are set in both the existing EQS, which has maximums but not minimums. And then in Act 153 of 2010, they required all school boards to have a minimum class size and ideal class size policy. And so we're recommending that you all mandate what that minimum is through the EQS. We do have specific numbers around that can be found in the policy brief as well. And we don't believe that class size is the only mechanism at that level. But one of the things that we're learning from superintendents is that the reporting of staffing levels more broadly is really disparate. So like how one school district reports contractors, for example, is really different from another school. And so we are recommending that the Agency of Education be required to define very clearly what those reporting requirements are, so that in the second half of the biennium, you all can make policy decisions that are really grounded in uniform data around staff to student ratios, so that hopefully we can start moving more towards the New England average.
And I guess this probably is a broader question than simply the funding and staffing size. One of the big arguments that many people are making is that we cost more than most, if not just about all other states on the one hand, and our performance is sort of average. And is that your observation?
I'm going to see if Libby has anything to say. She dives into the instructional data.
I think it depends on the district, quite honestly. And when you're talking about those specific figures, you're talking about NAEP. And quite honestly, I don't know how my district performs on NAEP because I don't see the scores. So though that data is certainly collected from our fourth and eighth graders, I think.
You don't see
I don't
data, for
get-
example, that says that your kids are reading at an X grade level, et cetera, and
Not
are
from
performing
NAEP.
math at an X.
Not from NAEP, which is where that statement is coming from. So I know very clearly where my schools are performing with the Vermont state assessments, as well as our internal assessments, and my schools are performing incredibly well. Not everybody can say that. I'm very proud of my schools because of that. So the assessment scores were above average according to NAEP, which is the world's kind of wide one. We score above average in literacy and we're about average in math. So it's an accurate statement to say that. It's not an accurate statement to say we're not performing well.
Yeah.
That's an opinion.
Sure, understood.
I think the not performing well was tied to how much we're spending. We had one school district that was at $44,000 a student. You should be performing very well.
Well, and the other thing that they find in the class size research is that the original thought that class size was really closely correlated with quality educational outcomes is becoming farther and fewer between. It's not as effective and it's not as cost effective as originally thought. That is a great policy mechanism for its buck to be able to move education quality forward. And in some of the research, like for example in Massachusetts and in California, is that policy comes with trade-offs. So small class size across the board comes with trade-offs because you're spreading high quality teachers out in a broader in more positions. When we know that high quality effective instruction is the biggest predictor of student outcome and success. And so thinking about scale is also thinking about quality and outcomes as well, particularly when it comes to being able to have highly trained and effective teachers in every classroom.
I have Senator Larkwood first and then Beth.
Thank you, Chair Cummings. I just wanted to draw a line under something we brought up in health and welfare this morning, which is that we have the highest healthcare costs, not just in the country, but yes, in the country, which means also in the world. So that does play a role in all of this, and I just have to keep bringing it up in here because since I'm on both committees, it always is in my face. Were you done with your testimony, Libby? Before?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just wanted to make sure. I just had a question around when the agency came and spoke with you all, and you presented sort of this conflict between what they were proposing and current Vermont statute. Did they have a response to how to reconcile those two things?
Yes, not a detailed one.
Okay,
So when I questioned the interventionist position, particularly, that's one that's near and dear to my heart. We have a highly functioning MTSS model in my schools, and I don't want to see it jeopardized because we can't afford it. That was not the secretary speaking at that time. It was the consultant speaking who referred me to Title I, to federal funding that would make up the difference in the weights. So that was not the secretary speaking. I just want to make clear about that.
Yeah.
The other pieces to that, however, were answered by that's a policy decision. Was a tagline that was used quite a bit when we were wondering about certain pieces of the financial model that they were proposing.
okay, so I can assume that to mean that we should go in and change statute to match up with the proposals that are coming forth. I don't know how else to
That would-
interpret that.
That would probably be my interpretation
Okay.
as well, although I don't want to speak for
Right.
the secretary, but that the policy decision was the refrain.
Okay.
And it may be my sense, since they're not saying close schools, is we were looking yesterday when we got a few details at one nurse for 750 students. Well, not that many schools with 750 students. And so they're going to leave it to the schools to decide, do we not have a nurse? Or do we cut something else? Or do we merge with somebody else? So we do have 750 students and we can have it, but we're not clear. We asked yesterday about the governance and the district sizes, and that will be next week's presentation. They have developed a theoretical model, and now they're going back and they are filling in the details. And as details come up, they'll fill in those cracks too, or leave it to us to fill it in.
And Senator Cummings, you had the benefit of being in my school board meeting.
Yes.
We're just talking about a 0.4 FTE position, which wouldn't truly influence programming whatsoever. Was an hour-long discussion,
Yes,
and that could not be cut. 0.4 we're talking about.
Right.
So the social pressures on our volunteer school boards are strong, as you saw.
yeah. I mean, having been served in local government, and I've never done a school board and never would. Because local government, when I got here, I said, they're at that end of the table. In local government, they're in your face in the grocery store. They are your friends and your neighbors. And I think the commission has realized, and I think it's been talked about in here, that it is not fair to ask local boards to make decisions. No matter which way they go, they're going to royally annoy 50% of their friends and neighbors. And they have to go out and get elected next year too. So that is an issue we're going to have to deal with. Yeah.
Which is directly connected to closing schools.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I think we aren't going to have any big economic impact unless we can do some consolidation. And I don't think we're going to be able to do a lot of that consolidation unless we do something about school buildings. Because we don't have buildings, 4 schools that could theoretically be merged. But none of them can hold one other school, never mind 4 schools. So we may be stuck with some infill filed some mergers. But, I think it is essential that when we come out of here this year, we have a roadmap as to where we're going and how we're going to transition so that people and kids know. I mean, my daughter was the first fifth grader to go to the middle school. And I can be very concerned that she had trouble finding her desk, never mind, you know, in a single classroom, never mind having to find different classrooms. She was my artist. So, you know, I understand that concern. I also know that she had absolutely no problem, and kids are much more resilient than I think we give them credit for, but it's concerning to parents, anything that is a change that could impact the kids. So we're gonna have to do our best to ameliorate that. Okay, Dr. Beth.
Chelsea, you said there was a minimum school district that you supported or were thinking of. What is that? Is there a number that goes with that?
Yeah, 2,000 to 4,000 is
So
what,
2,000 would be the minimum?
well, are set in a range between there. So
Okay.
like, we haven't put an actual finite number
But the
on
minimum would
that.
be somewhere between those two
Yes.
numbers. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
But your testimony said that 10,000 for you start to see the diseconomies of scale.
But research suggests that quality is best achieved in scale of 2,000 to 4,000. I'm happy to come back with the actual full brief. I didn't prepare for that because of it being financed.
Yes, it's not our job, but we find out sometimes unless we understand,
Yeah, for sure.
we can't make the decisions.
Yeah, so economically, the diseconomies of scale start around 10,000 to 15,000, but the research on quality suggests smaller than that. Not the best cost savings come from merging very small.
I think when we've got high schools with 24 kids in them, that gives me concern how not just the cost, but the quality. The classes, they have a very high quality, but there aren't very many classes. And that limits students' opportunities and abilities to learn what they really do love.
And the programs of study I've seen side by sides of very small high schools compared to medium-sized high schools or larger high schools. When we say larger high schools here, they're not large. So I just want to preface that. And there is a difference, and it's not because anyone wants a lesser experience for their students in those schools. It is strictly a scale and resources challenge.
It's money.
Yeah.
And high quality teachers are essential. And if you've got one in a school, and they could be teaching double the number of students they're teaching. We're not using that resource if they're only teaching 5 kids in a class. So, okay. All right. Other questions? No? Okay.
Would you like me to send the policy brief to the committee?
Yes.
Was that the VSA instructional scale document? I already got it and posted it.
Okay, thank you.
All right,
Everybody,
thank you for having
weekend
us.
reading. Okay. Yeah. Okay, your fairness. I'm starting to feel like I'm at a committee meeting. That's all it's before.
I'm not.
No, you're not. Neither is Libby, but
We're all interested in healthcare.
I know everybody else.
That's happening.
Well, this committee is also responsible for health insurance. And 2 of us are on the health and welfare committee, so,
The highest revenues.
which, as was pointed out to us in Woodbury last
Oh,
night,
really?
means we are the highest in the world since this state is, this country is the highest cost in the world.
Well, Jeff Anderson, yeah, that's not why I'm here. I would be happy to talk with you about how we think, much of the cost drivers in education that you spoke about, Senator,
Yeah.
are driven by healthcare.
Yeah.
And we think it's necessarily required, therefore, that we look at healthcare and how it affects schools and school budgets. Because it's probably the largest driver
And
of school spending right now.
then
So,
we will,
Yeah, so thank you
yeah,
for doing
we
that.
will be looking.
So for the record, Jeff N. among the as I said, here to talk with you, I guess, about the preliminary look at the governor's notions and how we spend and fund for public education in Vermont. We still, like you all, are learning about the details. Learned more yesterday about the foundation formula and the amount. Met yesterday with the administration in the morning, didn't learn the amount, but heard some more and heard more, in fact, during your hearing. So thank you for that. And your questions yesterday were helpful and instructive. And obviously, as I understand it, we're going to learn more next week about the governance side of the equation. I'll start by saying, first off, that Vermont did look into the votes that took place last spring and in November. And what we think happened is people rejected how we fund education. They did not reject their schools and school efforts in the local community schools. So that was we looked into this, researched it, and did some polling on it. The fact of the matter is people support the heck out of their public schools, and they also rejected how we fund it. And so that's a question of funding. So the foundation formula that we're talking about is how we spend it. The other side of the equation, or the earlier part, is how we collect it. So I'll get to that in a second. But the foundation formulas, as I think you all know, are used in many other states. So my peers are familiar with them around the country, understand them, and they gave me a couple of things to think about, and I'll share those with you from their perspective. Obviously, the amount has to be sufficient for every district. We believe you and your JFO colleagues need to examine the amount to ensure that it meets with Vermont standards and for adequacy, and not the out-of-state consultants. And that's not a slap at them. It's just that we look at things differently than do in Colorado. Bless you. As I understand it, and I met with a consultant and part of my membership on the Commission for the Future of Public Education, and he was asked, Justin, that how much had Colorado underfunded its foundation formula. At that point, it was $2 billion. Now, I don't know if we can get into how long it went back for and how big theirs is. So obviously, they're much bigger than we are. But he chuckled about that. So one of the other things is not only it should be enough, but you need to have an inflator attached to it that's realistic. And that if the state doesn't fulfill its end of the bargain on the inflator, that it doesn't then snap back and bite on kids and students and deprive them of decisions that adults make. That was one of the recommendations my peers around the country said. So that, and obviously we're learning more about the weights. Big discussion a couple of years ago. There's been some, discussion in this proposal to change those slightly here and there. We think it's also, again, advisable that you go back to your JFO colleagues and look at those weights and make sure that they are what we think they should be, and not, other places. Other places don't have the issues we do. And while, Chelsea spoke about the rurality of Kansas, I've been through Kansas. It's a very flat state.
That's why I thought it's flat.
It's very flat. And it's not at all like Vermont, where we have mountains that do get in the way, and you have weather of significance that gets in the way of getting the kids from one side of the mountain to the other side of the mountain. So, for example, the White River Valley Supervisory Union right now is a massive district from east to west in the central part of the state. And they, have issues getting around their buses, and that's a realistic problem we have that maybe Kansas doesn't. I don't know. I'm not that familiar with Kansas.
They have some pretty rough weather in
They do.
Kansas, but Barry Town has trouble getting around on icy days, and that's just Barry Town.
Every year, a couple of buses go off the road, sadly.
Or they cancel, and now they cancel because teachers live up dirt roads and can't get in. So weather is definitely an issue.
So
no
that's
matter what we do.
right. So the foundation formula and how you structure districts needs to take into account Vermont geography.
You won't hear your words up to the parents.
It's always the case, probably, right? More than we know.
Come on, secretaries, come on. Only for our high school.
In addition, we think that you need to include in the foundation formula equitable methodology for calculating taxpayer payments to private schools. So that's not been discussed much. We think that's a necessary part of the discussion going forward. How do we calculate that? How do we put that example? Not knowing all these details does make it difficult to give you a full assessment. But we are engaged, as I said, and as we learn more, we'll know more, and we'll probably comment. Just to be very blunt. What we also heard yesterday, and I guess you all did too yesterday, I'm not sure that the lowering of $180 million is actually being transferred to the lower tax rate for anybody, and that's or the lower taxes for anybody. So we're trying to. That is difficult for us to understand why that isn't more front and center, given what we know the voters rejected in last March and again in November. They spoke up and said we don't like how we're funding our public schools. So basically, they're saying our property taxes are not what we want them to be.
So that statement, are you arguing you want more savings than 180 million? Since year over year from last year, this year is about that 180.
Well, one of the ways we understand it, and again, the details are foggy at best, is that is coming out of staffing. And that's not what my members are saying to me. They're saying kids are coming to school with greater and greater needs. We don't need fewer adults working with students. We need, what we have, and what we have mostly are unfilled positions. And we need those positions filled to meet the needs of the students that are coming to them. So one of the things, and we do have a proposal to say that, Senator, which is to address the immediate need for property tax relief. We propose, and I've discussed this in Ways and Means, and we'll again, adjusting the income sensitivity cliffs. We haven't adjusted the $47,000 and $90,000 cliff for income sensitivity in forever, as I can tell. They haven't been adjusted for inflation. They need to be. Inflation is real. And so that if we simply did that act and did it now, that would be immediate property tax savings for 50,000 working class Vermonters right now.
What do you think of raising those? Raising those limits, like the 90,000.
Well, I think we worked with public assets. I think if you've got the 90 is the one I have stuck in my head. It's around 130 something, 137, 135. And that's just simply applying inflation to that number over the years. So that would capture and reduce property taxes for 50,000 working class Vermonters. Those are working people.
No, did the analysis actually show, because that money is basically raised by property taxes. That property tax credit is raised by property taxes,
right,
as part of the ed fund. So is there an analysis done? Is there actually going to be savings? No, is there actually a savings to that population of taxpayers? Because you're phasing out after the 90, and then when you get to 115, is there actually a savings? Because you have to raise property taxes on everyone to be able to get a higher credit.
And one of the things, our next step is, so it's a 3-step process for us. And one is adjust the cliffs, if you will, adjust for inflation. Number one. Number two.
With that, I think joint fiscal can do an analysis. And Julia is going to come in, and we did do a summer study on using income tax, which is probably where you're going.
Well, that's step 3.
And strange things happen when you start moving those numbers. When we thought we were going to get an impact on higher income, there was an equal and offsetting. It's like Jell-O that hit a group of lower income people.
Well, can we hear what?
But yes, we're going to hear what they say, but we will hear from Julia.
Yeah, I'm just curious what your number 2 is.
Number 2 is take a look at what's coming out of the now that wasn't previously. So starting in 2018, for example, the state teacher retirement system normal costs are coming out of the ed fund. Previously, since 1947, there was out of the general fund.
Right.
That started off at what, 8 million and went down to 7.8. It's now up to 35 million out of the ed fund. It's a shift from the general fund to the property tax, the ed fund.
But it is a cost of education.
Understood, but it, for years, 70 years, it was borne by the general fund.
Except we didn't pay it in, and we're paying hundreds of millions of dollars,
I'm well
and
aware.
you capitalized your health insurance, which is again, I mean, there's hundreds of millions of dollars of general fund going into the pensions. And that
and
came.
Right, and the online sales.
Right, but for years, I mean, the shift in sales tax, for example,
Right.
Senator Beck is, prior to that, we had a general fund transfer. We don't have that anymore. So we've done things to
Yeah.
the system to make it level it out or something like that, I guess you could say.
The online sales tax was not.
And it wasn't available.
It came in like.
Yeah.
What did they tell me? 10 days after we made the change, the court decision came down. And then we had COVID and all the federal subsidies, and people bought things, so.
And that's ever escalating, obviously.
Yeah, we're just starting to get a trend line in there.
The other option or other thing we think should be examined as to what's coming out of the ed fund that wasn't previously are mental health costs. I think last February, the Agency of Education identified the additional 1 year, year-over-year increase of between $50 and $60 million. And I know Libby spoke in this committee, I think last year, about a $10 million increase in her budget to these same costs. And we think that's a general fund obligation that's now been shifted to the silently to the ed fund and should be shifted back.
Actually, it's the mental health issues and the students have skyrocketed for
Yes.
whatever reason. We have, and the governor this year has proposed level funding, the mental health agencies. They did it last year. This committee raised money in fees in order to give them a whopping 3% cost of living raise. We have an issue there. We have not historically adequate, increased the funding there the way we have increased the funding to these state authorities. And they can do a really good presentation on that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I don't know if you're the right person to ask this question. Maybe you might know actually more, but what I've heard on that, I've been trying to dig into that a little bit. And one of the things I've heard in my area is that, that there's a competition between school districts and mental health agencies hiring school-based clinicians. And when they're funded through the mental health agencies, they're actually cheaper because they get Medicaid match on them. But if the schools fund them, they're more expensive. And so it's probably cheaper for schools to go through the mental health agencies, but they don't necessarily have the sort of, they don't then control that position. And so there's not as much flexibility. So they often will hire their own person anyway, and they're doing so at a higher cost.
What I've heard, and I'm happy to have Libby rebut this or add to, is that schools cannot find people to do the designated agencies can't find people, therefore schools can't find people. And so the schools are left then to hold the bag and pick it up.
Well, I think there's a competition between the two, and that the few people that are often going to the schools because they're getting paid more. And then there's this, that's driving up the cost of those services. I don't know if you.
That's accurate. So,
Yeah.
so there aren't people, I think both of you, it's like yes and,
Yeah.
right? Both of you are accurate in the sense of our designated agencies do not have the staffing. And when the kids come in our doorway, we are the only institution that can't say, no, you can't.
Yeah.
We have to support them. Teachers are not experts in mental health, so we had to go out and hire people. And we have hired them away from designated agencies because we pay more.
Right.
And we can pay more.
But the designated agencies can actually
Draw down
Medicaid, and so they're cheaper. So this sort of like competition and is driving up the cost of mental health care for schools. And so
I've been trying to figure out a way to, make sure that that is off of school budgets and more being covered by mental health agencies that can draw down Medicaid. To the extent that Medicaid is still a thing. But anyway, I think there are ways that we can still have the services, but do it at a lower cost. And not have it on school budgets or on the education fund.
What I've also heard is that, City County, particularly maybe, and Harris County, perhaps as well, may have the designated, or able and capable of doing it. What I'm hearing, is during the pandemic from the AHS folks, is that the system had collapsed, these things collapse was their work. It was likely to collapse out with their role state. That seems to be happening. And so those places where it's collapsed, schools, as Louis probably said, they're obligated to pick up and meet kids' needs, and they are doing that. But prior to that collapse, it was part of the HS budget, a general fund obligation that's now been shifted to the property tax. We think that should be examined more closely, as you say, maybe draw down more from Medicaid in any way possible, but also get it back to the general fund where it belongs.
Doing so would do the split staffing that I mentioned that often school districts don't like, because if it's funded on the general fund, they're not school positions.
Do we know if they're not there? No, I've got people. I'm wondering if they have canceled the school construction presentation. Because if they have, then I've got more time. If they haven't, I'm running out of time. Apparently, the weather is getting bad in the south, and they must have several people that are going south. So I don't think I have any southerners. I let you out early when it's getting bad in the north.
It's lovely up there.
I try and get them out at 3:30 otherwise.
I'll talk about it quickly. So no surprise, Senator, you are right. Our last step in the three-step process is to abolish the residential property tax and move to the income tax. We think there's a way to do it. We think there are ways to solve for what is often referred to as the renter problem or the renter issue. We think there's a way to do that, rather simply and elegantly, but certainly having to come through or have the system through and talk that through with you.
And because 2/3 of the people already pay based on their income, there were strange things that happened and I'm going to have Julie come in with not all, because there must have been 500 charts and graphs that got done for that committee, but the best ones, combinations. We would have to make changes. Now, there's been a change proposed in the governor's plan to do more of an exemption for certain base house value. And they're coming back, I think, next week to do a run through as who the winners and losers are under that plan. I have a feeling there'll be a lot of retirees, especially in high value towns, that are going to be losers because they'll have low income but high value homes. But we'll see how those runs play out, and then we'll decide how painful it'll be to make.
Right. So that plan will have hiccups and concerns and challenges.
Oh, yeah.
As with, and every, you can't go to the income tax because it's too complicated and too many issues. But you're solving for those perhaps on that discussion.
Right.
And we think you can solve the income tax ones. It's much easier to solve for them and actually much simpler to apply going forward.
And traditionally, we've done property tax because it has traditionally been more stable than the income tax. It didn't drop off when the banks closed or Wall Street crashed.
Right, I understand. Maybe the income tax may be variable as to me or you on an individual annual basis, but overall, the income tax is rather stable and funds the bulk of state government.
Things may have changed because we have more regulations on banks, not necessarily Wall Street. But part of the reason to go to sales tax is there was a certain amount of uncomfort with the people across the hall who were cutting holes in the safety net during all the downturns. And they had to, do an increase to schools by law, that the schools are protected. And that's been a decision. I mean, at the local level, the schools get paid. If the revenue doesn't come in, the town has to absorb the loss. The schools get their money off the top. That's been a long tradition, I think, in most states. And one I'm pretty sure we're going to keep, but that's why we had property tax. That's why they stuck with it in Act 60, because it's stable until the last few years.
Right, I mean, the property values have gone crazy lately, and
Yes.
certainly that's not stable for anyone.
No.
And likewise, income for an individual may go up and down. You may have a good year or not so good year, but overall, the income tax is rather stable.
So we will look at that.
Yeah.
As we go forward.
Yeah, and looking at the five, we'll call, a radical departure from where we are today, 5 school districts. Once we learn more, we'll know more and comment more. What we do know is that decision-making is further away from students, has students less in the focus of the decision maker. So we think it's important that you maintain some local, somebody close to the students and what's going on for those students in particular, and trying to meet their needs and addressing their problems and issues.
That is on schedule.
Like other
They
groups,
are on schedules.
we've been asked to assist in problem solve for the governor's proposal. We'll participate in that as we will. So that's the last, and I'll close with saying to Senator Brock that I categorically reject that we're not doing a good job. I think our Vermont public schools are doing a great job educating students. Here, the one exam, the test, the standardized test that Libby spoke to, and I think you're referring to, is the NAEP exam.
Yeah.
I was not aware that you didn't get the results of that. Last year, there was much vigorous discussion about the results of those, and nobody came in and said the school superintendents don't get those results. And so that's illuminating to me. Thank you for sharing that. I question whether we're testing the right thing at all. We're testing on standardized tests whether kids can read and read at what proficiency, or do math at what proficiency. And I think it's a great conversation to have. We should be having these research questions. It's awesome. And I think of Raj Chetty, who's a professor at Harvard, now at Stanford, who's examined this a great deal. He's the one why he piqued my interest originally. He said we should be paying kindergarten teachers $360,000 because that's their economic value to for teaching a high quality kindergarten teacher. $360,000 caught my attention. What he's saying is we're testing the wrong things entirely. Those are cognitive skills that we're testing, math and reading. And he says, why? It doesn't matter. As long as the child can read and do math reasoning well, what really is the economic determinative of their success later in life is whether they have non-cognitive, otherwise known as soft skills. We ought to be teaching and testing that. We don't do that and should. You really want bang on your butt. It's CHETTY, Senator Chittenden. He's a sharp guy. And I think that that's a better conversation to have. What are we testing and why? So
I want to see, since we seem to have a lot of behavioral issues in schools, if children that are going through daycare, then pre-K and K now universally, and I think that's what the governor's proposing. Arguably, if you've been through all of those, they're really socializing, civilizing. I asked my grandson, what'd you learn today? And he said to walk in the hall in a straight line. That's what you learn in kindergarten. You don't hit the kid next to you because he takes your pencil. It's basic social skills, how to sit in your seat for more than 2 minutes. It'll be interesting to see if some of that lack of socialization does smooth out as kids get socialized at a younger age.
So Jay will probably speak to this, and I know my members have said it a lot. What they see is a significant difference between those children who go through a program with a licensed teacher in a pre-K program and those who just go through whatever they're going through, the ones who don't, let's say it that way. a significant difference in their social skills and readiness to learn. Dramatic. So my board, and I have a couple of people who are kindergarten teachers who say that's really critically important to them and how they see students show up and getting ready to learn.
If we can find some documentation on that, that would be great. I'm gonna have to move this along.
Let me just add one thing in terms of a comment that I'm interested just in learning.
I think we have to cut you.
Reasons behind the differences between the various observers who are reporting on performance and the ability to perform of Vermont kids, which is why I asked for the footnotes, if you will, of the study so that I can make my own evaluation as anyone else does. You know the number of articles or claims that have been made about how kids in Vermont are doing in terms of their reading and math skills at various levels. And those reports that at least appear in the press have not been particularly favorable. My interest in this is to know, are there other statistics that are more valid, and where did the numbers, in fact, that the papers are used are coming from? Because they are different. And for each of my caucus, I gave this year as one of 2 books to read. And this one is called How to Lie with Statistics, because I see that constantly. I can ask a statistic on a particular issue and get 5 different answers depending on who I ask. And that's why I'm drilling in on it and will continue to do so.
Right. Other
I don't know who's right. And that's the point. I want to know who's right.
Any high school debate.
Well, I'll say this. I mean, kids are not widgets, right? I mean, that's every kid shows up differently. And
Well, yeah, but if you take 100 kids and
Right.
you ask them to read this, they can either read it or they can't, or at various levels of proficiency. And what I'm seeing here are people quoting statistics saying that we looked at this population, we tested them, and they did extremely well. They did moderately well. They did average, and they're all different.
Right. And mostly what I hear is the name score.
Yeah.
We used to look to the PISA score, which is an international exam of other developed countries. We're the only country that does that tests all our kids and teaches all of our kids. Most other industrialized countries fragment their kids in different ways and segregate them in significantly different ways
Mhm.
that we don't tolerate in this country and should not, I think.
You have to get into the right
Right.
kindergarten in.
Correct. And so I think, but if Vermont, last I looked, was taken as a country, we would have been the 10th best country under the PISA score. That's a really good score, I guess, if you want to just say that metric. And what I'm saying to you is, I think all those standardized tests, kids don't have any buy-in to the exam. It doesn't determine how they do or not do in their grade, if you will. And they know that at a very young age, because they're mostly told that don't stress out, this won't affect your grade, but we really want you to do a good job. That's how it's presented to them. Well, you hear that enough, and the kids learn, like, this is not going to affect my grade. I'll figure out this. I'll figure out how to test. They're bright, and as somebody pointed out here, they're more resilient than we think, and they're much smarter than we think on many occasions.
As a legislator, I'm interested in, are schools doing a good job or not?
Yeah, and I think that's a fair question to ask. I think the answer is yes. And we graduate.
Okay.
We have a high graduation rate.
No, I get it. It's
A success in life. But we don't have enough
High
kids.
graduation or low grad.
Okay, I'm gonna cut off the argument here.
Yeah.
Because.
I
we're
think
not
they argued well.
moving.
Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna move this along.
Thank you.
We also have a low continuation rate, so are we successful or not?
Let's see.
Who knows? And that's not in our jurisdiction. So we're gonna move this along, and I've got Jay Nichols from the Principals Association. And I've already cut out Senator LaRoche for today, because at 3, we're gonna zoom in to the presentation on school construction in the education.
Can you hear me okay?
Resource committee, I think we've got a witness up here. Okay, next week. All right. Here we go. Here we go, guys.
All right,
Jay
I'm
would
gonna,
apologize.
I feel like kindergarten.
I'm gonna jump right into it if that's okay.
Let's do that.
Okay, for the record, Jay Nichols, Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association. I'll go through prepared remarks. I'll do it quickly because I know you're on a time crunch, and then take any questions you might want to ask. I've been at the VPA for 8 years.
Jay, let me see if we can get you louder in here. Try it.
Test.
That's good.
Okay. For the record, Jay Nichols, Executive Director of the Vermont Principals Association. I've been at the VPA it's my 8th year. Prior to that, I served as a principal and a superintendent for over 20 years. and have also taught school finance to aspiring principals at the graduate level. So I'm going to have my comments initially be about the governor's report prior to what I heard yesterday, and then just a few bullets about yesterday. So first of all, the governor said he's going to be bold, and I think his approach is bold. I think, as we all know, the key is to fleshing out the details. We support the governor, and by we, I mean the VPA, supports the governor's goals of a world-class education at a price Vermonters can afford. And it's likely there's going to be varying views on how to get there. First of all, the concept of using one-time funds to take care of a projected 6% education spending increase this upcoming fiscal year is one we're certainly interested in. It's important to recognize, I think this was mentioned by Chelsea and Jeff, that much of that increase is caused by cost drivers that are essentially out of the control of local school districts. And even though I represent principals primarily, it's important to note that school board members in particular are put in positions in which they have very few levers that they can use other than cutting staff and eliminating programs. And the governor has acknowledged this, and I appreciate that. However, he did not mention cost drivers. And I think any plan needs to focus on cost containment of drivers, such as health insurance, like you folks have already described as a perfect example. The governor also talked about educational quality and equity, and we have agreement on this concept. We think that every Vermont child deserves to have a high quality education. Every Vermont teacher and other school employee deserves a fair wage. We believe this is true whether they are an independent, private, or public school, if they're receiving public dollars. If money is coming out of the education fund, then our stance at the VPA over the last few years has been same dollars, same rules, as a simple fundamental principle that all schools should live by. We think that Vermont owes that to all children. I want to touch on something Chelsea kind of talked about a little bit. When I was a superintendent in 2005 or 2006, if memory serves me correctly, we talked about a plan where every supervisory union would become a single school district. And eventually that led to a few different bills and partly led to what was called Act 46, as some of you know. And I was a superintendent at the time, and we were talking about moving from hundreds of districts. I think we had like 270 districts at the time to around 60. And that was considered pretty radical at the time. Now we're talking about moving to 5 districts across the state. And I think that might be a bridge too far. I worry about the scale of that. I worry about schools on the outskirts of these bigger districts not feeling as though they have representation on the board level. And I worry about schools and communities not being or feeling valued. I was glad to see Chelsea mention that the 5 regional superintendents groups was for meeting purposes only. As a member of that, a longtime trustee and treasurer of the Vermont Superintendents Association, I can affirm that that is true. I think in many cases, there's general agreement that we need to have a better scale, that our current scale in Vermont is not effective or efficient. We need to approach closing and or combining schools in a nuanced manner. We need to make sure we take in consideration things like time on a school bus for children, especially our younger kids, and also the future of small communities that may lose their school when in many places the school is really kind of the center of that community. This doesn't mean that we don't act, but I do think we want to be thoughtful about it and nuanced in our approach. I want to touch a bit on the base education amount. The importance of having a realistic inflator tied to some type of cost of living or some other index will be very important. Many states that have used a foundation formula have used the formula to squeeze public education while providing more money to choice schemes and private schools and voucher programs or things that have nothing to do with education. Oftentimes, in some states, general assemblies and governors simply refuse to provide the financial resources necessary for schools to be successful. Talking to my counterpart in Alaska, they talked about how for years they did not raise the base education amount. And what happened was poor school districts really suffered greatly, and rich districts were allowed to raise on top of the base education amount, and places that had lots of oil money and things like that were able to build Taj Mahal type systems where some schools were cutting teachers left and right and could not even provide basic educational needs. The governor mentioned in his speech 3,500 private school children. We need to make sure we have accountability for those children too. If we're going to have these 5 big districts, which again, I don't recommend, we need to look at what that means for those schools too. Maybe they become part of the big districts that are in their area. I just heard the Superintendents Association recommend you being allowed delegating choice to 2 or 3 schools or something along those lines. And lastly, before I talk about a couple of comments related to what I heard today about the amount of money that would be cut out of the current system, any protections that we put in place for payers, I'd like us to make sure we protect the people that need the relief. Let's not make working people pay more. Let's not be regressive in our system. Looking at some data from Public Assets last week in a presentation they gave, it really looked like that wealthier Vermonters were paying a lower percentage of their income than middle-class Vermonters. That is something we could definitely fix. I know you got some great, really smart financial minds in this committee. Senator Hardy and Senator Beck both being in there, for example. So please take a strong look at that to make sure that if we make changes like that in terms of providing support for taxpayers, let's make sure we hit the neediest taxpayers and support them first. And then some final comments added after hearing the proposal was going to cut essentially about 200 million from the current education funding system. I want to say without structural and governance changes first, I don't think this makes sense. I think it will starve our schools. It'll cut important programs and resources for needy children and significantly negatively impact an already overwhelmed system. It may compel changes to help the system in the long run. I want to be clear about that. However, the damage in the short run and to our current students who are all still suffering from the impacts of the pandemic is not worth it. We need to find a middle ground that provides financial relief without destroying our system and leaving students behind. I do think savings can be realized, and at the very least, we can strongly reduce the increased growth of education spending. To do that, though, we have to address cost drivers that are out of the control of school districts, like health insurance, unfunded mandates, money spent on things from the education fund that are not education related. And then on the base education amount, that amount matters. When starting a new funding formula, we should not approach it from a deficit model. Just cutting a bunch of money and telling school districts good luck is not an appropriate approach. They needed tools to make those cuts, and much of that will be dependent on scale and governance changes. So to ask for this level of cuts, which is essentially what we're asking for, without changing governance and scale first, I think it's going to hurt kids and programs. We can't move the cart without the horses. Putting the horses first, in other words, getting control of the cost drivers, deciding what our governance is going to look like, what the scale is going to look like, that's all going to need to happen before we can really get to the cost savings. And again, I think we can get the cost savings, and I think there's opportunity here, and we certainly want to do what we can to support that. I will say before, is Senator Brock still in the room, or is he gone?
He's there.
I'm here.
He's
All
under the screen.
Hi, Randy. I just wanted to say that on the issue of school quality, Jeff made a comment about Vermont being in the top 10. Now, that was true 4 or 5 years ago. I haven't looked at any data lately on that. I do know that we're usually amongst the top states in terms of performance. NAEP is an issue, though. In every state, there's a percentage of students that take the NAEP test, except for like 5 states. And in like 5 states, every single kid takes the NAEP test because our population is so small. So every 4th grader and every 8th grader in Vermont takes the NAEP. And Jeff is right. For a lot of kids, it's just they don't take it seriously at all. A better indicator is the state assessments that we take and looking at those and seeing in our own state assessments how those rank towards national norms to see how we're doing. And we certainly can do better, but we're doing better than the vast majority of states. Definitely lots of room for improvement. Our graduation rates are good, but we have some areas that we definitely need to improve on. I would not say that we've solved the problem, but we just need to be careful about concentrating too much on NAEP. An example I'll give you, principal called me last year, or maybe it was the year before, and said, we're not sure what to do. We submitted a standardized test report, and a kid answered all the questions by drawing a penis on his report. And so they called me, I called the AOE, talked to the assessment coordinator, and they made the executive decision to make the kid take the test again. And he did. He just checked C for every answer because there's no correlation to the kid. Kids don't see the results. And to Libby's point on the NAEP test, the schools don't see the results. It's a state result only. So in California, 1/50th of the kids take the test. In Vermont, every single kid takes it. So just something to keep in mind when we look at the NAEP test. And the reason we talk about NAEP, Senator Brock and everybody else, it's the only test everybody takes. If the United States had one assessment test that every single kid took in 4th and 8th grade, regardless of how many kids you have, then you'd have a lot better comparison of standardized test data. We just don't have that in this country because we're we have a federalist approach where education by the 14th Amendment is left at the state level, and the federal government, for the most part, stays out of education. And I think so each state's kind of developed its own thing. And that's all I have, Senator Cummings. Sorry for not being there in person, but I knew you were going to see me in person on Monday at North Country, and I thought that might be enough for you.
Okay,
Thanks much.
okay, and committee, just for an update, they have canceled in Senate Education. We were seeing it, they can't do it in a half an hour, so we've just bought ourselves some time if you have questions. Okay, I'm gonna do Senator Manis and that's Richard.
I don't know if it's for the room or you, Jay, about these standardized testing. You know, I don't have the financial mind of Scott Beck or Ruth Hardy, but I tried really hard when I took those tests when I was in grade school. And I remember all my classmates, we were worried about taking it. We tried hard. I didn't have anyone that just checked down the boxes. What happened over the past?
Yeah, are you talking about the NAEP though, or are you talking about the standardized test? Because I think schools.
Any test I took.
Okay.
Seriously, it didn't matter what the name of it was. And I was always told, you know, this test is for whatever it was.
Yeah.
I don't think I was ever told it wouldn't affect my grade, but
when I was a kid, when I was a kid, we took the Iowa test, and then there's been several different versions of that, and there's been the NAEP, and there's been the not NAEP, there's been the kneecap, there's been the Smarter Balance, the Iowa Basic Competencies. There's been a bunch of tests, and a lot of times those were actually put in with kids' report cards and things like that. Even when I was a student, probably when you were too. What's different about the NAEP is it's called the Nation's Report Card, and it's trying to compare state to state. The scale of that test is very, very high, and everybody acknowledges that. The experts that created that test said, if in an ideal world we said, you know, we wanted to have the highest reading standard in the world, what would it be? And that's the percentage they send for saying somebody's proficient. So you take the state overlays on that, and you compare that to the NAEP test. Every single state in the country's, their state tests are always going to be almost always higher than the NAEP test because it's just a very, very high standard. So when we're comparing states, it's fair. It's comparing state to state. It's sort of fair. The difference is that in a state like Vermont, Wyoming, really small population states, every single 4th and 8th grader is taking it. So you're getting the full state representation for that state. But in other states, it's a representation of just part of the state. So it's kind of hard to compare apples to oranges. I think it's worth looking at over time. The second thing with the NAEP test is it isn't done by your teachers. A lot of people don't realize that. They hire outside consultants that come into the building and they assess the test. And it's usually like retired principals and stuff like that. And the kids sit there and take the test. They're not with their own teachers. They are not told it counts towards anything. They're not told to try hard on it. The tests that you're talking about were like state tests. And we tell kids, do your best on that. Your parents are going to get a report on this. And they do. It's often a year later. But the NAEP test is not like that. And I don't think you took the NAEP test. If you did, you took it in 4th and 8th grade.
I don't know. I thought all standardized tests were the same.
No, they're totally different. Every state has different standardized tests.
When I was a kid taking it.
In New York, we took the Regents test, and that was very serious.
That's
Right. New York takes the Regents.
Yeah, I like taking these.
Same with us, Senator, same with us when we take, when schools take the Smarter Balance assessments and those tests that are state tests, schools really tell kids, you got to do your very best on this, really try hard. And those are assessment results we should be looking at, trying to drive and improve instruction. The NAEP test is not that though.
Okay. That's the one that gets in the pop-up news that shows
because
up.
it compares every state and they can just kind of say, oh, Florida's doing better than Vermont or Vermont's doing better than Massachusetts. That's what the NAEP test.
That's one I saw. Vermont used to do really well, but they've dropped in the last few years was the comment.
And that is true. We have dropped in the last few years and it's something we need to be aware of. And we should look for trends to see if there's areas we should be improving in. What's really interesting to see is that, you know, the states that shut down the most with COVID and had less people die, a lot of them did worse on the test than the states who kept their schools open, even though adults were dying. So, you know, you got to think about those things too. We shut our schools right down and we went to online. And so we've seen our 4th graders haven't really improved as much as we thought they were going to. A lot of those kids weren't in school when they were in kindergarten and 1st grade. They missed those kindergarten and 1st grade years. Some of the states didn't shut down at all.
Yeah, no, I have a grandson, so halfway through kindergarten, missed foundational years, and he is still.
I got a grandson the same age. I got 10 grandkids. I got 2 of them that are kindergarten, first grade. It's the same thing, Senator.
Thanks, Jay. So I too do not have the financial line of Senator Hardy or Senator Beck, but I'm going to try to keep up with this. And,
I'm
one thing
hoping that Senator Hardy and Senator Beck don't get big heads. I probably should not have said that.
We'll settle
But
down.
I heard in your testimony something that I think it needs to be called out, that you do recognize that there are opportunities for cost savings. And there are things that we can do to reduce spending in our schools. I would like to ask you, knowing that, and we've seen multiple reports out there, that Vermont does have the lowest or highest, however you want to do it, staff to student ratios. And just looking at this recent document that was in part of Zoe Saunders' presentation to the entire legislature, I want to say a week and a half ago, showing that from 2019 to 2023, the support services category of staff in Vermont went from 4.7 per 100 students to 5.9, far exceeding the increased rates for the student services leaders and teachers rate. Do you, as a principal, knowing the schools and knowing your constituents, think that it is worthwhile conversation to talk about the staffing levels that we have added over the past 4 years, and to question if we can A, afford them, or B, can find other ways to maybe achieve those same necessary supports, but in more economical ways that might increase some of those cost efficiencies you spoke about?
Well, I think one of the ways we do that is to really look at scale, and to look at scale. As I'm doing this, I'm looking for a piece of research that I want to share with you. As we look at scale, I got that right here. Hold on a second. Okay. According to the National Center for Education Statistics, public schools added 121,000 employees last school year, even as they served 110,000 fewer students. On a per student basis, that means that public school staffing levels once again climbed to all new highs. And what has happened with that is that the vast majority of those folks are support staff folks, and that's across the United States. And I think your point's important, Senator. I think there's 2 levers here. Lever number 1 is the scale issue. We have a lot of small schools, and we need, and people, even some of my own members get upset with me when I say this, we need better scale. There are schools that need to be combined. We have schools that are too small, where there's schools right near them, where it would be pretty easy to combine those. And if we went to governance systems, like we had suggested in 2005, making every SU a district, or even districts now of 2,000, 2,500, 3,000, 4,000 kids, drew those lines out, there would be some economies of scale. You'd be able to have, instead of having a 3rd grade with 10 kids and another 3rd grade with 8 kids 5 miles away, you'd have a 3rd grade with 18 kids. That's not unreasonable. And I think the quality of teaching would not go down, because right now, to my knowledge, we have about 800 teachers on provisional license. I think that's the number I heard. And having less of those and more high qualified teachers would be better. We can have bigger class sizes in some places. I also think we have a situation where we often will hire a support staff person, like a paraeducator, to support a kid or support a group of kids. And sometimes they're actually giving instruction to those kids, even though they really shouldn't be. And I think by having high quality teachers in every building, we can address that. So I think those are a couple of levers that we can reach to. The other side of that is, my members tell me all the time that the mental health needs that the kids are coming to school with now are incredible, and so much more than they ever were before. I teach new principals, and I had a new principal telling me last week, we meet once a month for a full day. In January, she has a student who's a cutter, who openly cuts herself in class. I think the kid's a 3rd or 4th grader, is bleeding on paperwork and stuff. And they've called crisis, and now crisis has said to them, well, we're not going to come anymore. There's nothing we can do. The parent doesn't want support. The kid won't cooperate with us. That kid still comes to school every day, and the school is going to try to deal with that. So when you don't know what to do, oftentimes what you do is you hire a body to help try to stop that kid from doing that. So this kid now has an adult who's following her around. She doesn't need an adult for any academic reasons. The adult's just there to make sure she doesn't grab sharp instruments and cut herself. There's more of that than we've seen before. So the mental health issues are really, really concerning. I talked to Dave Melnick from NFI the other day, and he told me that sort of what Senator Hardy said. They can't find people. Schools can't find people, so we're competing over the same people. And there's just a real issue of not being able to find the mental health supports that a lot of these kids need. And these kids that are really struggling, they take a lot of resources and a lot of time. And I don't have a magic answer for that. But I do think the opportunity, to your original point, for scale is absolutely there. As a principal, I always said, you want 400 or 500 kids in an elementary school, you want 500, 600 kids in a middle school, you want 700, 800 kids in a high school, if you can, because then you can offer more opportunities for kids. And I think that there's a lot of value to that.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Randy.
I just want to go back to the issue, and I don't want to kill it or beat it to death, but this, both Jay and Beth have mentioned the issue of Nate. There's an article in Vermont Public that appeared on Wednesday of this week, in other words, yesterday, that talks about NAEP scores in Vermont. And it says the latest results from the National Education and Educational Progress released Wednesday show continued steady declines in reading scores for Vermont 4th and 8th grade students. And while Vermont students fared significantly better in math, scores still reflected a slide toward the national average in both subjects and in both grades. And it goes on. It has the charts, it has the stats and so on, which is why I raised the issue. Because the question becomes one of, if we're paying substantially more than virtually any other states for education, why are our scores trending towards average? Or is the number wrong? Do you have stats in what you're providing to us that are materially different and that show we're not looking at the right measure? I just want to try to get a better understanding. If what NAEP is claiming or what National Public is claiming relative to what the NAEP scores are and what they need, if I'm misinterpreting it or if they are wrong. That's what I'm trying to find out.
And I think there's a difference. If we're testing all our kids, then we've got a much more mixed bag. California can only test the top 10%. They're going to come out higher, right?
Is that the
But-
case though, or are they
Yeah.
testing a selected as opposed to the top 10%?
No, they're not. Just let's be clear, Mr. Senator Brock. They're not testing their top 10%. I'm not saying that. They're
Right.
testing a random 10%.
Yeah, that's what I assumed. That's
Yeah.
exactly what I assumed.
So,
Yeah.
but if, no matter how we're comparing to other states, if our scores are sliding compared to where our scores were last week or 3 years ago, that I think is the thing.
And
we
that's what
need
this,
to
that's
be-
what the charts, at least in that
That's
article.
where I would be more
indicate.
concerned.
Yeah, I think you're right, Senator. I think I said before that I think that's absolutely true. I think part of that is the scale issue. I think part of it is that we shut down our schools and we went to fully remote, and some other states did not do that. Some other states still had their kids getting a lot of instruction in person. Vermont, we chose not to do that. And you could make the argument that we saved a lot of lives by approaching it the way that we did as a state. And I full credit to Governor Scott for the way we approached that. But the research shows that the schools that closed the most and had kids not there in person are doing worse on assessments now, which kind of makes sense. If I didn't get kindergarten and first grade and I didn't get the foundational executive functioning skills I'm supposed to get, now I'm in 4th grade and I'm testing against kids who did get those, that does put me at a disadvantage for sure.
We're gonna have to move along. Martine, did you have a question?
Not a comment. I can make it brief.
What, brief?
The test scores are the test scores. I think the issue is the cost of education in Vermont, and we have underscored and highlighted over and over again the reasons why education is expensive in the state of Vermont. That is what it is, and that is what we're trying to fix. I just want to leave it at that. Whether it's construction or size, scale, healthcare costs, these are all part of the situation.
Right. We won't even get into housing. We will get into health insurance in this committee, but we have issues with being able to attract, because we get teachers that come here, they can't find affordable housing, and everybody has a teacher shortage, and they can go elsewhere, make more money and afford a house. And that's there. And it's hitting businesses, it's hitting everybody. Okay. Jay, any last comments?
No, just thank you for listening and thank you for the work that you're embarking on. It's not easy. Let's just, let's go slow to go fast. Let's just make sure we take our time, make good decisions, and I appreciate the effort you folks are making. Thank you.
Just stay in touch and keep talking with us. I don't know if it's any consolation, but I feel like we might be able to find a solution to this one. I have no idea what to do about healthcare. And we're gonna have to figure that one out too, if we're gonna have any real impact on the cost of education, because that is a major driver. We can cut down staffing costs, we can consolidate. But unless we massively cut staffing, then health insurance continuing to go up. Our hospitals are in trouble, our federally qualified health centers are in trouble, and our prime insurance company is in trouble. So we have hit kind of financial wall on all of these things this year. And it's going to be an interesting year.
Well, it's critical that we get answers to those questions. And I
Yes.
hope the educational industry and establishment is not thinking I'm picking on them by focusing. I'm not, because I'm saying the same kinds of thing to the healthcare industry.
Yes.
Why do we see Vermont sometimes on a trend that is not as good as we'd like it to be on in multiple places? And all of this, such as the cost of healthcare, as you mentioned, has a dramatic impact on the cost of education. And we've got to get answers to a lot of questions, and we're not going to get the answers unless we ask them.
Fair enough. Happy to talk to you.
Okay, we're gonna move on to Morgan Daybell, and we're now 45 minutes late, so I hope, okay, you are still with us.
I am, and I will be characteristically short given the time. For the record, my name is Morgan Daybell. I'm the past president of VASBO and the current CFO for Franklin Northeast. And thank you for the invitation today. I've submitted some written testimony. I won't read it. I'll just hit a few points, largely the ones that I don't know have come up from the previous speakers, but we certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here and look forward as we get more details from the governor's proposed legislation and we get some actual legislation to look at. Look forward to the opportunity to have some of our members come back. I think Jay and Jeff, and I'm sure Chelsea and Libby, who I wasn't able to hear, covered a lot of the points and a lot of the questions that we all have based on what we've seen so far and what we know is coming from the governor's proposal. I'll kind of speed through and just talk about the change to the funding model and some of the questions that our members have. And they're around primarily how we transition to a foundation formula, if that's the direction we go. As Jay had tipped, how is that going to be adjusted in the future? Will we be allowing districts to spend more than that foundation amount? And if we do, where does that money come from? And how is that generated in a way that would comply with the Brigham decision? What would budget votes and budget development look like for districts who are not spending above the foundation amount? And then lastly, how the proposal specific to the funding formula, is there any way to sort of address some of those underlying cost drivers, the mental health needs, increasing salary, healthcare costs, facility costs that others have mentioned? I'll put a plea out there, I guess. Last year, the transitions with Act 127, the last minute fix that went through the legislature in very quick time, and then the chaos that came out of that surrounding the delayed budget votes and the multiple budget votes, I hope has taught us the importance of having very thoughtful implementation when we touch how we fund education. Any change to what we are doing, any change that we're contemplating really requires both a significant enough runway so that we can figure out what the impacts are going to be on the ground and some robust modeling with input from the folks in the field so that we can identify any unintended consequences before we're dealing with them in real time. As Jay had mentioned, we're also appreciative of the governor's offer to alleviate some of the funding pressures for this year with that $77 million transfer and to really buy some time or some space in the room to discuss some of these big changes. The hope is that there's a recognition that that money is coming from somewhere, and we don't want that $77 million to equate to, further cutting mental health services. So while our property taxes are not going up, the needs that we're dealing with are going up, and we're needing to, to add more staff to deal with those cuts. So I will leave it at there. Again, there's written testimony there, and I'm happy to answer any questions before you all head out.
Okay, committee, any questions? Okay, thank you. Summary of what was heard. I think we need to move forward thoughtfully. We need to have a dependable transition and a spread transition. We need to look at the reality of topography. When we're setting districts, and how do you get economies of scale at the same time? Not having kids on buses for too long. We know we have to deal with spending above the funding, the base funding, and if that's allowed, and if it is, how that works with Brigham. We have to find a rational size. And then the thing about voting, I am not at all clear that there is going to be voting. At one point, what I heard was that local advisory groups or local schools advisory councils could decide, or school boards, whatever they get, would decide how they spent the money. But the amount of money they got would be set. The system where local schools voted on how much they spent is being replaced with a foundation formula, which then they may be able to vote to spend more. I gather they can't spend less. They could.
They keep what they don't spend?
I don't think we'll let them keep what they can spend. The concern has always been that some schools with the weighting, with anything, there's no guarantee that that money actually goes to additional services for students. They can go to buy down the property tax rate.
If it's up for discussion at some future point, I like the idea of allowing them to keep what they don't spend underneath the base allocation that they might possibly get, because that incents frugality. And it wouldn't, I see budgets where you spend it, you use it or lose it, people use it, and I'd rather us them hold it and then be able to carry it forward to future expenses.
Provided they are providing an adequate education. And at what level? At the top level. But next week we will hear the government, so we won't know what the issues are until we hear that. But that question about local voting, will there be any? What will it be on? That will be, they are not proposing any school closures, but they may find that schools are forced to merge because they can't afford to stay open with a basement or provide the services they want. I got the menu.
I just wanted to sort of respond to your comment, which I think is a good one. I think if a district wanted to spend below what they were allotted, why shouldn't they be allowed to? But the key to that is that that decision would come from a local body. Sure. Because local bodies understand the needs and the wants and the issues of their community much more than some centralized, organization. So that's really, really important. An advisory board is an advisory board. I don't see how an advisory board can be making decisions. They're just in an advice. So that is, one of the things in the weeds that we need to figure out. Really, really important.
And we haven't been told yet what the proposal is.
I figure the other theme that seems to be evident that I don't think people are disagreeing with is our 119 school districts is part of the governance problem that is making less than efficient decisions at the local level about how we're delivering education in Vermont. So I do see the answer that I'm in support of is flattening that governance structure so that we start looking for more economically sized school districts to achieve the efficiencies that we need.
There's local and there's hyper local.
Right.
And I mean, there's a suggestion on the table to, I think the word, I don't know if the word is dissolve, but the supervisory unions, which are really inefficient. And that is something I think we should discuss.
We should probably have someone come in and tell us what all of those things mean: supervisory unions, supervisory districts. And I think we will have Beth St. James come in and maybe do an education primer 101, because we aren't the education committee. But we will at some point, just as senators, have to vote on this, and you should know what it is. It's always helpful. So I'll get that set up.
Because we're gonna have to go to our voters and explain this to them. So we do need to understand it. Yeah.
You gotta do that?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think you know.
Yeah, when the
My
right
voters
names
are gonna
get
want to
put on
know.
the chip.
Honest, Senator, don't worry. Come on.
Some of us have had this pleasure. I got to do Act 6 in my gold tickets.
Lucky you.
It was. Okay, so I think that's it. I'm gonna get you out a few minutes early. They can't do the presentation in the few minutes we have left. And if it's getting bad further south, it will probably be here shortly. And we've had enough accidents this week. I'd like to get everyone home. I was glad to get back from Woodbury without having it snow last night.
I do look forward to speaking to you all about school construction though.
Looking forward to
I
it.
can't wait, honestly.
The big piece of it.
Yes, fair enough.
Oh,
It is a
everybody
big
is the money.
It is a big piece. It
How
puts a
much
strain on the
money?
hedge fund, that's for sure.